Hello and welcome to the CSI Litigation podcast brought to you by Courtroom Sciences. I'm Ava Hernandez and I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Steve Wood.
Hey,
Steve,
Ava.
how you doing today?
Good, good.
Good. Thank you for joining me. I'm really glad to see you. I recently had this conversation with our other colleague, another member of the team, Bill, a couple weeks ago, and I'm real glad to be speaking to you. Today I'm doing a little bit of an interview, hearing something about your background and what brought you here to this very odd, interesting, and unique line of work that we've got.
Yeah, well, I'll try to keep up with Kanaski. I don't know if I'll be quite as entertaining as him, but I'll see what I can do.
It's always a challenge. That's the challenge for us all, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I'm kind of curious to hear because I don't think, similar to my conversation with Bill, we haven't gotten really a chance to kind of talk about this ourselves. So I'm very curious to hear what brought you to this world, right? How did you first hear about litigation consulting? What brought you into this role?
Yeah, I get asked that all the time, because obviously we're in a kind of a niche area, and everyone's always kind of like, "How do you get into this?" But truth be told, I've wanted to be an attorney. I've always had an interest with the
Really?
law. Yeah,
Oh,
so since I was about 7 or 8, I just, when you did those things in class, what do you want to be? Mine was just always attorney, and it was never really the thing. A lot of times when you're growing up, everybody says, "Oh, well, doctors and attorneys, they make all the money, so that's what you want to be." I just did it because that's just really what I was interested in. And
mm,
then, I was actually, funny enough, when the OJ Simpson trial was going on, I was thir 13 at the time. And I basically watched the whole thing. Like when I was on summer break, it was always get up, watch OJ's trial, and get a sense for what was going on for the day. So I've always done that. And in fact, today, before we jumped on here, I was actually watching court TV. So that's kind of what I
oh,
do
wow.
in my free time, is watch depositions and watch court TV. So anyway, that was kind of the goal, was always to be an attorney. And then my senior year of high school, I started taking a psychology course. I really liked psychology, and then kind of fell into the idea of psychology and the law, and initially wanted to go into the FBI and be an FBI profiler.
Oh, wow.
But those jobs are few and far between. They're very hard to
They
get
are.
into. And, as I got into it and doing a little bit more of the work and stuff, some of the content area just got a little too dark for me, just to separate it out. So I do like to listen to true crime podcasts and read true crime books, but just immersing myself more into it was a little bit more than I really wanted.
Mhm.
So fast forward to my senior year of college, one of my professors had done done some work in this area and said, "Hey, I know you like legal stuff. I know you like psychology stuff. There's this field of, litigation consulting, where you can kind of do both." So I ended up going to a conference, American Society of Trial Consultants, and I met with someone there who was looking for kind of a research associate to start off with,
Mhm.
and did some work with them. And then, just kind of have been in the business really since 2007 as a research associate, and then, kind of junior consultant, and just learning as much as I could from all the people that were around me to now.
Mhm. That's really cool to hear. I think it's such a fascinating niche area where the intersection of psychology and the law, and it's something that there's an incredible amount to flesh out, I think. So, when you started doing your PhD, did you plan on your PhD is in social
Yeah.
psychology, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Was that what you had originally planned on? Has social psychology always been something that interested you, other than, besides the other sort of forms and theoretical areas of the psychology umbrella?
Yeah, I mean, I always kind of wanted, like I said, when I went with my PhD, the goal was always, and one of the first individuals I worked with, Stuart Simon, who had originally worked at Decision Quest, and he's now at American Jury Centers. Those guys were kind of my first mentors. That
Mhm.
him and Alan Campo, I owe a lot to, as far as mentoring me and kind of getting me immersed into this field.
Yeah.
And they kind of said, go for a PhD and try to learn a little bit more about the psychology aspect of it and stuff. So I just kind of wanted to always go get my PhD. And then it was always kind of a bent towards juror decision making so that I could understand the business better. And yeah, I've always been the type of guy who always wants to understand like why people are doing things, and there's this kind of idea of the cognitive aspect of like people make decisions from internally what they're thinking inside their own head and what kind of experiences they have, Whereas the social bent is, how does our interactions with other individuals shape our perceptions, shape our thoughts? So that to me has always been interesting to just kind of look at, our environments, where we grow up, kind of the values and attitudes that we develop externally, how it kind of shapes our thought philosophy. So I think it makes it really good from a jury decision making standpoint, because you and I just did a mock trial together, and it's always interesting, right? When you have these individuals making their decisions on their own on their sheets of paper, but once as soon as they get into the jury deliberation room, you get to watch people's leadership styles. You get to watch who's the strong personality, who's the more quiet personality, and how does the strong personality influence the quiet personality, because that
Mhm.
quiet personality had a perception and idea of the case prior to the deliberation room, but as soon as they get in there with 6, 8, 10 other people, all of a sudden now their opinions have changed, and how strong they feel about certain things have changed, and whether or not they'll articulate what they want, or how hard they'll fight for what they want, changes once they get in the room with other people.
100%. That's so interesting to hear you say. I mean, I agree wholeheartedly. I think I find, systems thinking to be something very interesting. Sort of the person is not just an individual. We're here stuck in the middle of a system and an environment that's intersecting and interacting with our individual personality, and ultimately creating the ways in which we view the world and the decisions that we make from that. And I think that way of thinking is particularly amenable to jury selection. I
Mhm.
don't know if you think otherwise, but what you're saying is sort of considering the person within their environment. So in jury selection, considering how that one individual would interact with different personalities within a group environment, and the ways in which people will influence each other. Do you think that your sort of social psychology thinking, how does that influence the way you select jurors or look at jury selection in a group of individuals in particular?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, like I said, the kind of the cognitive psychology, the more individual clinical psychology obviously has some value. The social is just like a different aspect too. So I think that's why I lean on you and Bill for a lot of that type of stuff, because you guys have the more clinical aspects of it versus the social aspects. But yeah, I think that's what helps me from a jury selection standpoint. Yeah, because when I'm looking at jurors and I'm trying to select jurors, it's not a matter of just how is this individual going to vote in the jury room. It's also, like you said, how is this juror going to influence others individuals, or how is this juror going to be affected by what they're hearing from the attorneys, what they're hearing from the witnesses, all those types of things. And just trying to understand what that witness testimony is going to mean, not only just what the witness is going to say, but how's that testimony going to influence the individuals that are in the jury box. So yeah, it's always, I'm just constantly, that's why I like jury selection, is it's always constantly trying to evaluate and predict. And I do it all the time when I'm like driving and when I'm doing other things. I'm always trying to predict human behavior. Like when I'm looking, what are you looking at this person, kind of their attributes and their actions and stuff? What do you think's going to happen next? So I'm always constantly doing that. I can't shut it off. That's one of my weaknesses.
Yeah, I understand, and I relate. So is there something, I often heard this from working for attorneys for so long. There's sort of a trope, I think, in the legal field of, maybe law school doesn't fully open you up to what the actual day-to-day experience of being a lawyer is actually like, right? Did you have a similar experience from sort of hearing about this whole world in theory to entering it in practice? Was there anything that surprised you about this world, this industry? Anything that you weren't expecting to see, or that, maybe stood out to you?
Yeah, I think I think one of the things I always thought, and it happens like with that academia, everything's very theoretical, theoretical, theoretical,
Yeah.
versus being applied. Right? You have these theories about what things are going to do, but then what happens in the lab versus what happens in real life are two different things. So I think that's one of the things I always try to keep in mind is, yeah, I read literature, I read books, and I read scholarly articles and stuff like that, but you always have to kind of take it with a grain of salt, meaning that the information is informative. You can use it in your decision making, but sometimes things aren't quite as cut and dry as they are in a paper when you actually get out there and get into a room. So what may transfer over in an experimental setting isn't necessarily what happens in the real world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I relate to that very much. It's the difference between theory and applied is very interesting. And I think what we do is so cool and really special because we get to be at the intersection of that right there and see the ways in which theory actually comes into practice, and reading all of the literature and talking about all of these, theoretical notions, but then seeing on the ground and actual, mocks, seeing jurors actually deliberate or seeing jurors talk about it and visualize the ways in which that actually comes into fruition is so fascinating.
And I think sometimes it's interesting to see some of these people who are very theoretical, very academic, struggle to try to take what they learned in the classroom and what they're doing theoretically and try to transfer it over because, we've seen probably some of our own people in the past and stuff like that. Like, gee, this job is a lot different than what you think it is. And the theories don't fit. And like, if you go in with that mentality, you're going to struggle because it's too rigid. It's too formulaic. And that's just not how juries work.
Yeah, everything is so complex, right? And you almost have to suspend your own notions or ideas about things, even, concepts, psychological concepts that have been studied. And we have some evidence and some hard data about the existence of these concepts, right? There's still a window and a spectrum of the way in which those concepts actually manifest in the real world, right? And I think we do have to leave ourselves a little bit of space to be surprised
Yeah,
by.
exactly. I'm always surprised, right? We're always,
Yes.
oh, that's something new. I never heard that before.
I love being surprised, and
Yeah.
I love learning, and I think that's something all of us here on the team really have that character trait a little bit. We all like to learn. We're all curious, and we enjoy being surprised by new information.
Yeah, and I've
Right.
always I've always been a big proponent of you never stop learning, and I've
Right.
talked before on podcasts that I've done where if you think you've gotten to a point where you know everything, well that's a problem, right? I'm constantly you and I were just talking the other day, right, about new books we're going to buy to keep reading
We
and keep
were.
reading.
We were, yeah, one of my favorite quotes is Whitman, the only thing I know is that I know nothing. And I
Yeah.
think about that all the time, right? If I approach things from a place of a little bit of humility, I tend to actually be able to um, give better advice, right? Sort of counterintuitively.
And I think it's refreshing when we deal with attorneys a lot of times, some will be a little reluctant to have us help because they're like, what is this guy or girl going to tell me that I don't already know? But then a lot of times they get it, but it is really good to work with most of our clients are very good and very open to say, hey, Steve, hey, Ava, help me with this, right? I defer to you on these types of things. We defer to them on the legal stuff, but it's always refreshing to have them say, what do you think on this? Help me with this. And I think that just shows that they're open to it. So it makes it a lot more beneficial relationship when you do that.
I wholeheartedly agree. Mhm. Uh, how does how do you think the litigation landscape has shifted since when you first started? Have you seen any trends that have changed? Have you noticed anything that's really adjusted? The legal world has changed a lot, I think, especially since COVID, but I'm curious to sort of see if you've observed anything and what your own observations are on that.
I think since I started, before when I was first started into this, the reptile theory book wasn't even out yet.
Yeah.
So, reptile obviously has shaken up things and that whole notion and Rick Friedman rules of the road and David Ball's on damages, all these kind of books like the plaintiff's bar is doing a lot now. Like, I mean, I remember meeting David Ball before David Ball was the reptile guy, and listening to
Yeah.
him speak and stuff. So it's kind of interesting to see at the time he was just David Ball, another litigation consultant, and now kind of what he's done and what Don Keenan and a lot of these other good plaintiff attorneys have done, about sharing information and getting this stuff out. I think that's one of the biggest things I've seen is this kind of shift from the plaintiff's bar to being a lot more aggressive in the way they're working up cases. But I'm
Mhm.
also seeing now the defense bar coming back too. So this was kind of early on. The plaintiff's bar was getting really aggressive and gaining a lot of traction and winning a lot of big verdicts. But now you're also seeing the defense bar coming back and sharing more information and kind of understanding what's out there, what are the theories that are being pushed by plaintiffs, and then how are we going to work against that. So I gotten a chance to kind of see all the ebb and flow of it. And, being that we're more on the defense side, almost essentially exclusive outside of any sort of contract and, any of that type of stuff,
Mhm.
I think I'm looking forward to the defense bar continuing to do what they're doing and, getting some more defense verdicts and making sure that the damage awards are more online where they should be, and trying to help diffuse some of these nuclear verdicts or shock
Mhm,
verdicts or whatever you want to call them
mhm,
nowadays.
absolutely. Um, Do you have any, particular research interests or anything about this area that's especially fascinating to you? I know you've talked a little bit in the past about sort of attorney ethics and things like that. Is that a big research interest of yours, or what do you do in your spare time? What do you look up, Steve?
Yeah,
What are
lots of
you
stuff.
what are you Googling?
So it's funny that a couple things. It's a couple part question to that. And it was one of the things I forgot about. You kind of said what new things are you seeing? What trends are you seeing? But the newer thing that I'm looking at now is traumatic brain injuries.
Yeah.
We've talked before that that's a big thing that we worked on a case where just recently where there was a traumatic brain injury, and traumatic brain injuries are coming up very often in cases, and they're frustrating to me. And the reason why they're frustrating to me from a defense perspective is because they're so subjective, and
Mhm,
everybody nowadays is claiming a traumatic brain injury. And if you have a Glasgow coma score of 15, that doesn't mean anything. And if you
mhm,
have an MRI or a DTI scan that doesn't show anything, that doesn't mean anything. It's
mhm,
like you're damned if you do and damned if you don't from the defense side. There's always a way to kind of get around it in the traumatic brain injury. So that's kind of my next goal, is to look at a lot of that traumatic brain injury stuff. I just got a few traumatic brain injury textbooks that I'm going to go through and start studying that. We just put some questionnaires into our initial questionnaires, as some questions about traumatic brain injury that I'll be collecting and wanting to present on and write papers on and stuff like that. So right now, that's kind of been my main focus, just because from a plaintiff's bar perspective, they've gotten a lot of traction on those topics. But from a defense bar perspective, I'd like to figure out a way to kind of defeat that, because like I said, there probably are some instances where people do have traumatic brain injuries, but there's
mhm,
also instances where people are just saying they have a traumatic brain injury because, hey, why not? It's going to be too hard for you to try to figure out whether you do or you don't, because we'll come up with an excuse for any
mhm,
of these sort of subjective or objective tests. So
mhm,
that's one. And then the second part of your question, my main focus too is also on attorney credibility. That was my master's thesis. I looked at it from a criminal perspective. My doctoral dissertation was looking at attorney credibility in the civil perspective, just kind of looking at how attorney credibility influences juror decision making.
mhm,
And when I first initially did it, I was hearing from a lot of attorneys where they're like, who cares the attorney credibility? It's the strength of the evidence, not attorney credibility. I mean, you
mhm,
or I could do that as long as the evidence strength is strong. Who cares who's presenting it and all that? And so I kind of wanted to go against the grain on that and start looking at it and see whether or not is that true. And no surprise. And I talked to a lot of attorneys now, and they're like, yeah, whoever said that initially didn't really know what they were talking about, because it absolutely matters who the attorney is, and it absolutely matters how the attorney presents things, whether or not they're organized, whether or not they appear empathetic, whether or not they are persuasive, whether or not they appear to be talking down to the jurors. Like all that stuff matters.
mhm,
So then I've just continued to look at that and refine that and find out like what are these factors that matter to jurors, so that I can help attorneys kind of understand these are the things that matters. These are the things you need to focus on. Some of these other things aren't necessarily as important.
mhm. So interesting. And how do you think attorneys can come across credibly? Is that a sort of a posture, a general way of presenting evidence or telling a story? Is how can attorneys, and I know this is something, again, you wrote your dissertation on this. I'm sure you could talk about this for hours, but just generally speaking, is there some quick tips or tools that you generally tell attorneys when they are talking to jurors that will help them be perceived as credible?
Yeah, I think the main things, right, is you just have to look prepared, because how many times have we seen, whether it's in a mock trial or even in real trials, where somebody's fumbling with the paper, or they're skipping around on their PowerPoint presentation, they're going too fast, and they got to flip back,
Right,
or they don't really, or they stand behind the podium and they don't leave the podium because they're stuck to their paper, because if they were to leave their script and leave their paper, they're not going to know what to talk about. So
right.
I always talk about getting to the point where you've prepared ahead of time on what your slides look like ahead of time, kind of going through and making sure you know your script so that you can walk away from the podium and kind of interact with jurors and that. So that's one of the first ones. Just being knowledgeable about the case. The other thing is just coming across as trustworthy and not sounding like you're just trying to say you whatever you think the jurors want to hear in order to help your client, because
Mm,
that's one of the things where the plaintiff bar hammers on the defense. I mean, it's one of the things that they talk about. Don Keenan refers to them as the black hats,
mm,
essentially as these kind of unscrupulous attorneys who will burn justice in order to save their clients. So you want to avoid that kind of perception that you're kind of the slimy, slick attorney. That you want to be more honest and forthright. So those are a few of them. And then at the same time too is kind of understanding the human side of it, is that, and being empathetic in a lot. And how many we just heard recently, right? As the one of the attorneys didn't come across as appearing empathetic, and the witnesses didn't necessarily come across as appearing empathetic.
right.
So just kind of understanding, especially in personal injury cases, that someone was injured, whether we had any part in it or not, at least acknowledging the fact that someone was injured is also helpful. Now, you can be sympathetic, you can be empathetic, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have to blame. You don't have to take the fault for it, though. You don't have to fall on the sword for it. So there's a delicate balance of understanding, like, well, we don't want to seem sympathetic because then it seems like we did something wrong. Well, no, there's a divide where you can do both, where you deny liability but also understand that someone was injured.
Mhm. Yeah, that's very interesting. And I agree. I think that there is certainly a delicate balance there. And I think also, the easiest way to kind of come across empathetic or to come across being forthright, upfront, and honest is to actually be empathetic or to actually just
Right.
be forthright, upfront, and honest, right? I think sometimes we get so caught up in perceptions we forget that if we actually just are those things, then that comes across to jurors, and all that people want to hear. I think we see this over and over again. Is just some humanity, right? And just a human being talking about other human beings in a manner that's kind, right? Even in the midst of litigation, I fundamentally believe that even in the adversarial system that we have, and even in the middle of civil litigation, we can be kind to each other. There can be a little bit more humanity in this process. Do you
And
agree?
I think one of the other things too is it's as much as we hear all the time, these jurors are stupid. Jurors are stupid. They don't. Jurors aren't as stupid as you think, and you
Oh,
can't really BS the jurors. And if you come across as like being fake empathetic or being, fake contrite or any of that type of or genuine and that stuff, they will smell it. They will call BS. And how many times have we said? How many times have we heard in focus groups where like that attorney was full of shit? Like he was coming in here and he was completely putting on a show and he thought we were going to fall for it, but guess what? We didn't fall for it.
exactly. Right. That's tough. That's a tough balance to take, 'cause I think it means sometimes teams have to kind of go back to the table, look at the facts of their case, and then change the way they're going to defend it, right? Because it sometimes actually being honest and actually being empathetic bumps up against our need to defend, right? And that's a delicate balance sometimes, I
And then
think.
also we also see it too is I think you bring up a good point, not only from the trial perspective, but from the witness perspective. You and I have talked about this and have written about this, and we'll probably write about it again about kind of the emotional being empathetic when working with witnesses too, that I think sometimes gets glossed over. So it's just not only necessarily being empathetic in front of a jury, and if you're not, the jury's going to call you out on it. Same thing with your witnesses, is spending time with your witnesses, spending time to be empathetic, try to understand where they're coming from, understand what their emotions are, is another thing too, to help build rapport. And if you're just going in there and trying to, let's get to the meat of it, let's start doing mock cross examination questions because we got to get you ready for your deposition. The witnesses are going to know, okay, this guy doesn't really care, or this girl doesn't really care about me. They just care about the case. And now you get a little bit of a pushback on them too, because now it's like they don't trust you because they figure the only angle you have is in order to save the case and the client, and you don't really care about them. But if you can get to a point where you're empathetic towards them too, I mean, how many times have we seen where witnesses who have been defensive, who have been emotional, when they get a feel of trust and rapport with the attorneys, all of a sudden kind of let their guards down and then they just flip, And I was just telling you how I was working with a witness that was told, oh, they're going to be a difficult witness. They're going to be hostile. And, you know, they weren't really. And once you had an opportunity to do it, you could realize there was this underlying agitation. There was an underlying scaredness about going into the deposition. But once you address that, And all of a sudden they're not hostile anymore.
Right. I've certainly come across that myself more than a few times. This
Yeah.
person very difficult. This person's very complicated, and then you kind of walk into the room, and you realize, no, this person's terrified, confused, and utterly uncomfortable with this entire situation. That's a different thing,
Yeah.
right? And being hostile. And if we can get to the root of that, then that hostility tends to dissipate.
Hmm.
Right. So we do an awful lot of stuff. I mean, we were just talking about witness prep, our focus groups, our mocks, and just sort of the general advice and strategy that we try to give clients. Is there something that's in jury selections and everything in between? Is there any part of the work that we do that you love the most, that particularly speaks to you, that, is just something that kind of lights you up? Is it all equal in your eyes?
I think I enjoy all of it. I mean, I think each one of them has its own kind of positives and negatives and stuff like that. I love working with witnesses because, like you said, I love taking witnesses who are quote unquote hostile and making them more comfortable. I love working with witnesses who are scared of the process and making them more comfortable so that they don't step in things in their deposition. But like I said, then at the same time, it's always fun with the mock trials of
Mhm.
getting 18 to 24 people in a room, hearing all these different perspectives, and then especially the focus group at the end, right? When we go in there and we get a chance to talk to them and interact with them and all that. So I enjoy that. And then, obviously jury selection for me is really fun too. Yeah, I was looking at it as kind of like high stakes chess. So I really love the kind of the competitiveness. I'm extremely competitive.
Mhm.
Like I said, I'd be pissed if I lost.
What, you, Steve Wood,
Yeah,
competitive?
yeah, extremely competitive. So jury selection for me is like going back to playing sports again, right? So now it's like, to me, it's high stakes, very, high stakes chess. So I like the thrill. I like the kind of the excitement that I get from the strategy of, okay, they have this many strikes left, we have this many strikes left. Who's left to come in the box? Do we need to? Should we pass? Should we keep? All these different things. So, like I said, each one has its positive and negatives, but jury selection is also stressful too because you're in the court and you don't want to make a wrong decision that could, negatively impact the case. So, like I said, there's pluses and minuses to all of them.
Yeah, there's beauty and pain in everything that we do, I think.
Exactly.
Pros and cons and some awesome stuff, some not so awesome stuff. It's
Yeah.
just intrinsically attached to some of these things, I think.
But I would argue though that there's not much else I would do, like back when COVID was happening and everything was kind of shut down and it was kind of like what's going to happen here is that, is this still going to be a thing and stuff, and that was just like, well, what else am I going to do? And it's like nothing.
Yeah.
That's us. It's either this or nothing.
I relate to that, Steve. I think, it's just such a unique niche world, and it speaks to a certain kind of person, and it speaks to the type of person that can navigate and speak, I think, a few different languages, right? Because I think that the law is sort of a language all of its own. Humanity and psychology is a language all of its own, and then just people, the different cultural identities and communal identities that people hang on to is also a language all of its own. And combining all of those things in ways in which we can see those, make sense of them, find out where they intersect and how that's going to influence these different parts of the whole is so strange and interesting and utterly fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, you think about it, right? We work with truck drivers, and when you work with truck drivers, your language changes and you drop a few more F bombs than you normally
Better
would.
believe it.
But then you work with surgeons, we work with hospital CEOs. I mean, we run the gamut of all the people we work with. And the same thing when you work with jurors. A lot of times you're going to work with jurors who have no high school education. You're going to have ones that have a doctorate, and everything in between. So I think that's where the value is too, is what's always interesting is you have to kind of constantly be adjusting your perception or adjusting your approach based upon the person that you're working with. And I always try to make sure that I'm always kind of matching the person I'm working with. If I need to work with the CEO, then the way I'm going to approach it's going to be a lot different. The problem is some people don't have the ability. Some people struggle with, okay, I'm working with a truck driver. Now I need to act like with the truck driver, like I would with the CEO. But if you do that, you're going to make a fatal mistake because that truck driver wants to be like they're talking to another truck driver. They don't want to make it sound like they're talking to someone who seems like they're sitting in the ivory tower looking down on the fact that's like, oh, well, I have a PhD, I have all this, I have that. You're just a lowly truck driver. They don't want to get that perception. And so I always think that that's always interesting too, to try to deal with all the different type of personalities. But I think that helps me to kind of stay humble a little bit, to allow me to go and still play slow pitch softball with my friends who are all drinking beer and stuff. And then one of them finds out I have a PhD and they're like, you do? I'm like, yeah. They're like, well, how,
Surprise.
yeah, yeah. They're like, well, you don't act like those. It's like, cause in my world, we have to adapt to all the personalities. So I'm not looking down on anybody because I have a PhD versus someone who doesn't have even a high school diploma.
Mhm. I love to hear you say that, and I agree. And I think, the law, like many industries, in the corporate world, I think is attracted to pedigree, right? And attracted to how much education you have, or where you went to school, or things like that, that perhaps have some bearing on someone's actual ability to show up and do a good job, and perhaps they don't, right? I think that's something that's pretty up for debate these days, right? And coming into an industry like that, and then I think translating and navigating between those different worlds. And I hear you. Sometimes I'll be doing, a witness training over Zoom, and my husband works from home, and he'll come walk in and go, I keep overhearing you just drop these F-bombs. What's going on? It's going, well, it's my trucker witness,
Yeah.
you kind of got to, right? And I agree, you have to meet people exactly where they're at, right? I'm not going to stand in front of them and then force them to come to me. That's unrealistic. And just from a social science and from a clinical perspective, it's probably also not going to work, right?
Right.
What's going to work is if I go to them, right? And together we move somewhere else. But me being in front and kind of waving them towards me, it ain't going to work. And it
No.
may actually cause some harm,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
Well, Steve, thank you so much. I feel like I could talk to you for another 3 hours, so I won't. This was very interesting. I love getting to know a little bit more about you and your perspective and your mindset, because I think that's a big part of this role, and what hopefully we can all bring to the table as much as possible is our training and our experience, and just the ways in which we see the world, is valuable, and is valuable to the work that we do. So I'm very always interested to hear what's inside people's minds. So thank you for sharing that, Steve.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to be on, and like I said, we'll have another episode where we'll flip the script, and I'll be interviewing you, and we'll get a chance to hear a little bit more about you. So I'll be looking forward to that as well on future podcasts.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all the faithful listeners. Thank you to everybody listening to us. We are available if anyone needs. We're always happy to answer any questions, or talk to anyone about any of your needs. You can reach us, on LinkedIn. You can reach us online at our website, courtroomsciences.com. And this has been another wonderful episode of the CSI Litigation Podcast, brought to you by Courtroom Sciences. See you next time.